Bangalore feels young and youthful and eager to experiment. Bangalore is actually called the Silicon Valley of India. About 42% of India's startups are born here every year. It has become this thriving magnet for talent.
India's startup scene is booming. This year alone, the country has seen over 36 unicorns, private companies valued over $1 billion. And much of this impressive growth has happened in record time.
The last decade and a half, it's a sea change. We live in such a different world today. I think in 2006, if you said we would have 10 unicorns, let alone close to touching maybe 100 unicorns, that would have looked madness.
From last September to this September, there is on an average 3 unicorns every month. So it's a clear indication of ecosystem maturing.
India has had a record year of IPOs. But with a recent stock launch faltering and fierce global competition, can Indian startups keep up this breakneck growth?
Unlike in the old days when we had to build everything from scratch, today a lot of the infrastructure for creating a company exists. The challenges will be how to succeed in the business before somebody else does better. So speed and execution is becoming even more vital.
So India's technology story goes back at least 5 or 6 decades when the government decided it needed a strategic location to start a whole lot of defense-related technology companies that would serve government's armed forces. Since then, Bangalore became the location for a lot of those companies, and to support them, a lot of educational institutions have come up in and around Bangalore.
The government chose Bangalore as the place to build its defence industry, as the southern Indian city was considered a safe distance from its rival countries Pakistan and China. In the early 80s, smaller private companies also began to shift their operations to the city, among them Infosys. In 1981, with initial capital of $250, 7 engineers set up the business, marking the beginning of the private tech industry in India. Today, it's one of the biggest companies in the world, with a market capitalization of over $95 billion.
Infosys, in some sense, is India's original startup. When Infosys began in 1981, it was in a socialistic era when India was not really that friendly towards business, and we had many challenges. For example, just getting a telephone connection would take 2 years. To import even a single computer, you had to go to Delhi to get a license. And even if you had to make a small change in the configuration of the computer that you purchased, you had to go back and get the license changed all over again.
Then came economic liberalization in the 1990s. The government deregulated markets and reduced taxes and import tariffs. Infosys and other IT companies thrived. In 1993, Infosys went public and built India's first software campus in Bangalore. Prompted by this technology boom in the 1990s, people from all over India poured into Bangalore to work or study.
So Bangalore was the takeoff point for a lot of those people that came to study and then went overseas to study further to get postgraduate degrees or work in a lot of these global companies, perhaps most of them in the United States. And they made a comfortable life for themselves overseas and never returned. But something changed in the late 1990s and 2000s. Bangalore became a valid destination to chase a career in technology on its own.
Many local talents, especially those from humble roots, decided to stay. Lots of overseas Indians returned to Bangalore as well. Vani Kola was one of them. She built and sold 2 startups in Silicon Valley before starting a venture capital firm in Bangalore in 2006.
I was in India end of 2005 for a long trip, which I hadn't done in the 2 decades that I was gone. And for me, it was just a very different country to the one I left. There was so much confidence, so much potential, so much opportunity. I saw a big future for Startup India. What I saw was the underserved consumer experience. India consumer story, just ready to embrace many new business models and entrepreneurship that could successfully build very high scale companies.
But the startup culture itself, I could trace back to about 2007 when Flipkart was born. So Flipkart is one of India's two large online retailers. Two engineers who used to work for Amazon decided that why don't we start an online retailer like Amazon by ourselves? So the two of them got together in a little apartment not far from where I'm standing in Koramangala in Bangalore, and they decided to start Flipkart.
Like Amazon, Flipkart started out selling just books and slowly expanded into other areas, including fashion, by acquiring e-commerce startup Myntra in 2014. Kola was an early investor in Myntra.
Flipkart acquiring Myntra was a really smart move. Flipkart had already dominated many categories except fashion at that time, and Myntra was the fashion leader. So it made sense that combined they would have a only real horizontal platform that truly came out of India.
And today, Flipkart is one of the biggest startups in India. The company was bought by Walmart for $16 billion in 2018, making the two founders billionaires.
The story of Indian e-commerce started out as definitely not something that we see today. I don't think anybody expected what really happened in the last 7-8 years. It's been a tremendous journey.
There used to be a time when startup entrepreneurs in India were shunned. Entrepreneurs or people who worked in startups told me that in India's arranged marriage system, parents were not willing to have their daughters married to startup entrepreneurs or workers in startups. That whole thing has changed because of people like Sachin Bansal, Binny Bansal, the two entrepreneurs who set up Flipkart and sold it. All of those stories have now made being a startup entrepreneur or working in a startup a very valid career option for a lot of young Indians. The turning point for a lot of the technology startups, and particularly the internet startups in India, has been the arrival of Reliance's Jio Telecom service. 4 or 5 years ago, when Reliance launched the service, India had very expensive broadband internet. Now, Mukesh Ambani, one of the world's richest men, decided that he wanted to offer calling for free and data broadband internet services at dirt cheap prices. Smartphones were becoming cheaper. A lot of Chinese brands were introducing really sleek, inexpensive devices. So multiple types of internet startups started getting launched in India, and particularly in Bangalore, startup ecosystem started catching fire.
A part of that early ecosystem was online education firm Byju's. Today, it's become India's most valuable startup with 7 million paying users. Unlike the first generation of Indian tech companies who solve problems for global companies, the current generation of startups like Byju's are trying to solve local issues.
Initial years, when we were offline, scaling that model was a big challenge. We started this to solve 3 big challenges which exist in our education system. One challenge around access to good teachers, learning driven by fear of exams, unfortunately, and not love for learning. And more importantly, it's impossible to personalize the way you deliver classes when there are 30, 35, 40 students sitting in a classroom. Now, to solve these challenges at scale, it's very important to use technology as an enabler. At the right time, when smartphones were taking off, apps were taking off, we were able to launch our first learning app. That's in 2015 August. And with time, with more people coming online, with data becoming better and cheaper, we've been able to scale our model around. So using smartphones as a medium to reach out.
2021 has been a breakout year for these startups. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many consumers have turned to online services for grocery deliveries, tutoring, and medical diagnoses, contributing to surging revenues.
Billions of dollars have poured into India. In July, for instance, as in China, the Communist Party has cracked down on a lot of these technology companies. Indian startups gathered almost $8 billion in venture and PE capital, making India for the very first time overtake China as a venture capital destination.
Record numbers of unicorns have been born at an unprecedented speed, and investors are hoping to profit from companies that could become the next Google or Facebook.
Global investors always asked, where is the exit? And in startup lingo, that means, how do I make a return on my investment? Suddenly, a lot of these startups have plans to debut in the public markets. And now that is a legit exit. And investors then triple, 4 times, 10 times their investments. That is what's happened this year with the public market debut of a food delivery startup called Zomato, which was really the game changer.
I think thrice in our journey, we've gotten to a point that we can't do this anymore, right? And this just cannot be done. But we actually continue for one more day, and it all gets over, and it all starts again.
Zomato as a company is neither profitable, and its medium-term prospects for profitability are really mediocre. But retail investors have lapped up the shares of Zomato, sending the valuation of the company soaring to $13 billion on debut.
But digital payment firm Paytm's IPO in November, which is India's biggest ever, has been a disappointment. It raised $2.5 billion, but the stock price has sunk dramatically, making it one of the worst initial showings by a major tech firm since the dot-com bubble era of the late 1990s. Like Zomato, Paytm is not profitable, and its IPO debacle casts a shadow over other Indian startups.
The Indian startup world has to show that they are not only building growth, but also profitability. When you look at the founders of the first generation of companies in India like Infosys or Wipro and so on, they were, as I said, they had to be financially very prudent. They had to generate profits from their business and feed that back into the business, because that was the only source of capital that we could reinvest. Today's entrepreneurs are encouraged by their backers to grow quickly, even if they don't have to make a profit. The thesis is that once you grow and reach a certain critical size in the market segment of your choice, then you can always make your company profitable.
Profitability is still ways off for a lot of the startups. Of course, there is a 1.3 billion market that on the face of it seems like a humongous market, but then there is the other side to it, that is not enough people with spending power. It all depends on how many consumers can afford to buy, how much of a middle class India can grow each year, and who can, afford to buy these services.
India's 40,000 startups also face other challenges to grow bigger. Compared with China or the US, India's internet industry is still much smaller in size, and the bureaucracy faced by India's first generation of private companies still exists in some ways today, pushing some startups out of the country.
Sometimes I hear frustration echo through entrepreneurs' voices when they talk about, things that are needed to, say, apply for an IPO or, get a permission to set up an entity, how complicated the rules are. Corporate taxes are very high compared to countries like Singapore, and a lot of the entrepreneurs have then chosen to shift their bases to countries like Singapore because they find that the tax regime in Singapore or elsewhere is much friendlier.
While it is easy enough to start a company in India, as you scale, I think you run into a lot of areas where regulation is not clear. One thing would be industry by industry for government and government bodies to continue to work to be a step ahead in terms of providing clear regulatory guidelines and continuing to engage industry in modifying that.
But starting up in India still has advantages. Half of the Indian population is under the age of 25. Young Indians adapt to technology easily and could be potential consumers with spending power in the long term. They also provide the country with a rich talent pool.
India has about 4.5 million software engineers, and within the next 10 years, this is going to double. So as the technology talent improves in the country, It will provide a fertile ground to create more startups.
It's still a nascent ecosystem, just about at takeoff point, but a lot of entrepreneurs are actually dreaming big.
Entrepreneurship is, it's not a skill, it's a mindset. It's a mindset where you don't take no for an answer. If you are passionate about what you are doing, and if that is making an impact, I'm sure that we can do this for decades.